people come in with the pain of banging their heads against the wall, doing things the way they have been doing them. They get a glimpse of the liberation that happens when you realize you don't have to know it all to move forward. There's this liberation that happens when you realize you get to co-create. You don't have to do it alone. There's the liberation happens that you get to have an authentic confidence, not a fake confidence, but you actually get to have an authentic confidence where you get to generate new ideas and move them into action. That you get to see your flexibility and your adaptive responses happening in challenging conditions. You get to notice that when somebody comes at you with feedback that would have felt like an attack, that some part of you actually gets to have curiosity, and then you get to join in and move forward together. Whoa, like, which would you prefer? So there's the joy of actually getting to watch people shift the paradigm of what that they're functioning, realizing, first of all, there is another paradigm. There are other paradigms. You get to use the old one whenever you need it, but there is another way of perceiving the dynamics in our human relationships and getting to play with them. And that's so I actually get to be around that kind of transformation on a regular basis in situations that you would think are absolutely impossible. I'm Wendy C. Morris. I'm based in Minneapolis, Minnesota, which is in the heartland of the United States.
You and I don't really know each other.
No, no.
And I was in a group with yourself, and
Mhm.
you had said these terms that I'd never heard of. But we were having a discussion about how to have more diversity and inclusion within some of the engagements that we're all trying to run.
Human systems dynamics it's a field of theory and practice that builds adaptive capacity, and it helps individuals and groups, organizations find options for action in complex situations. In other words, how do we influence change in environments we can't predict or control? Noticing that there were metaphors and insights that were arising in the field of complexity science that had implications for how it is that we navigate human systems. And sometimes there were metaphors, there was language that was really a very different paradigm and an innovation in how we think. It's almost like an innovation in logic, and realizing that a lot of the things in the training that they had been doing was no longer working. What actually are the nature of systems, and how do we work with them? Wasn't coming out of OD. The literature was coming out of complexity science. And they went on some retreat and said, okay, if this isn't organizational development, what is it? It's a different field of study, actually. And they actually met to name the field. And they named the field Human Systems Dynamics, a formulation that has lots of possibilities for application for people who are on the ground trying to make change. I should say that I come not out of the science world, but I come out of this intersectional where it's people working together across lots of differences, different sectors, different cultures, different backgrounds. So this really cross-sector collaboration world is where I come from. And also a lot of working with art and culture. So I actually come more out of the poetic side of what these metaphors mean from complexity science. But I think about complexity as just very simply the inability to separate anything from its context. If there's a continuum between science and the art and poetry, I'm more on the poetic side, and I collaborate a lot with people, my colleagues, who are deeply embedded in the science of it. Somewhere between touring the world as a performance artist and teaching at cutting-edge leadership centers, I discovered I had a gift for helping change makers embody how to shift patterns in environments and conditions and organizations and communities. And especially for those who are trying to set conditions for a more equitable and sustainable future. So if I have a superpower, it is to be able to very quickly absorb a framework for collective innovation and then design and facilitate some process that helps people embody new ways to move forward across our differences. Do you want an example? Okay, so a lot of the languaging that I've developed has been hard won. It's been trying to help pass on a lot of years of working with how transformation happens in human systems, the level of my own heart and mind, the level of our relationship, the level of teams and organizations, enterprises working with city government and community at different levels of scale. It's the same process, how healing happens, how transformation happens. It's the same process. It's just, it's just takes different capacities to function at different levels of scale. And one of the capacities I had to develop was to be able to talk about what I knew was effective in transformational processes.
Wow, you said some pretty profound things. Healing is transformation. A transformation potentially is healing. And you also said that we each potentially have a knowingness. We have a knowing, which is a combination of the entire neural network of our bodies and potentially another layer of knowing, as well as an accumulation of learned experiences that all come together to form our knowingness. And just having the knowing doesn't mean that we have the language to express this knowing. But potentially that knowingness might be the greatest value that we bring to our teams. Does that resonate?
Yeah, I think, what is the knowingness that also comes from our generational cultural wisdoms. And how do we translate that insight, those perspectives, that perception, so that we can engage with one another in ways that collectively enable us to move forward.
Lovely.
So actually, the example was about that the ability to, on the spot, create some kind of embodied way for people to grasp a new way of understanding related to complexity in systems. So this was a leadership institute that was started and convened in Halifax initially, Nova Scotia, and it was around organizational learning. And it was the ALIA Institute, Authentic Leadership in Action, originally Shambhala Institute for Authentic Leadership. And that was developed by Peter Senge, who's the one who really framed up sort of learning organizations, and Juanita Brown and David Isaacs, who were sort of the initiators of the World Cafe movement, and Meg Wheatley, Leadership in the New Science. I mean, there was just a whole network of people who had come together. I was at this institute. It was my first time there. I later went on to teach there for about 9 years. But the first year I was there, I was in a room and I had never come across any of this language that people were talking about. I didn't know what, if you'd asked me what people were talking about, I would have said, I have absolutely no idea. Okay. I was in a room and there was someone who was a physician, somebody else working in some kind of nuclear science. And we were in a large group of people, and they were having this conversation about I couldn't even say what it was about. I actually couldn't even say what it was about. But as I was listening, I just said, wait a minute, is this what you're talking about? And I stood up and I just started and I started jumping up and down. And I said, with somebody on the other side of the room, would you jump up and down at the same time? And I said, okay. And I started jumping up and down. I said, just everybody else, just notice what this is like. And person on the other side of the room, would you jump up and down? This was somebody I think who was actually running for the a position in the Green Party, like somewhere in Nova Scotia. And he starts jumping up and down. And I said, how does it feel differently when the two of us are jumping up and down compared to when I'm just jumping up and down? And the two people who'd been having this conversation using a lot of complexity, language I didn't understand, they said, that's exactly what we're talking about. It's a non-local perturbation of the system. So basically, there's this disruption that is happening, and it's happening in different, and because it's happening in these different locations, it's impacting the whole. And the person who is sort of politically running this sort of Green Party kind of sort of came over, said, I want to try something. And we started jumping up and down together next to each other. And people said, you're a threat. So it was like this, so it was this way of exploring, how do you influence the whole? And people had this very visceral experience of, oh, okay. When it's one person, you're just a freaky weirdo. When there's two of you standing by side, you're a threat. But when you are non-located, you're located far apart in the system, and you're doing something that is having the same activation from completely apart. We can't even see both of you at the same time. You're too far apart for us to even see, yet something is resonating in us that we cannot deny. So I can remember I was dancing as a frog in Hansel and Gretel at the Metropolitan Opera. It burned a question into my own heart and mind, which is, how could we use the resources of our creative capacity to support communities like mine that were struggling for basic dignity? And how could we use the joy and the vitality and the connection of these communities that were struggling financially to be able to enliven just the systems that we function in, so that they actually, everybody gets to thrive. All of this coming together for me was the potential to be able to not be so afraid of change. If we could bring all of this together, we could actually find a preferred way of living that would be more appealing than freezing to the status quo. Like, how do you use these ways of knowing? The messages that are coming from the body, from the collective, to be able to heal, to transform what's happening in my own system, what's happening in these larger social conflicts. A lot of this work then evolved to a lot of the deep democracy work that was happening in South Africa as part of the post-apartheid. So it's just, again, it's the same principles, but activated at different levels of scale. I had drawn some of the principles and the knowing and the understandings from process work, psychology, and from world work, and had applied them in the leadership work that I was doing around community innovation. I was stewarding a 3-year pilot to advance the racial equity goals in city government by pairing mid-career community-based artists, organizers, cultural leaders as provocative thinking partners in city departments to work on projects specifically designed to build more authentic community engagement with communities that the city had a notorious history of broken trust with. Raise their own awareness of the dynamics of power and the dynamics of rank. And I'm talking rank as like the sum total of a person's privileges, that somebody can or can't assume in a human system. Some aspects of rank are inherited, the conditions we were born into, that, including, class and geography and skin color, and the psychology that we have based on the stability or instability of our early caregiving environment. But there's other aspects of rank that are a little more flexible, that aren't what we inherit: our emotional intelligence, our spiritual maturity. And we tend to be more conscious of the rank that we have than the rank we don't have. So it's a lot easier for me to be aware of the rank I don't have as being female in a culture that privileges male gender rank. It's than it is to be aware of the rank that I have being white, the rank that I have as my education. What actually is the sum of privileges that each of us carry, and how that really flips depending on the context. And sometimes I make that mark and sometimes I miss it. Because again, we have lots more blind spots in the places we don't have rank. Colleagues I have who are functionally illiterate, but they walk into a room and they can command the presence of that room just by their ability to transcend and to see the whole. Some people collect stamps and some people collect bottle caps, and I collect definitions of power because I think it really matters. I was teaching at Alia, and which was a place where people were coming together to look at systems change, the intersection of systems change and complexity and contemplative practice, specifically mindfulness practice and dialogic practice. So that people from all over the world were coming there. I'd done a lot of collaborative work, and I know what it takes. I know what it takes to do it well. I know the investment. COVID lockdowns were happening, and people in healthcare were really, I'm shaking my head like this out of just shock of how hard the conditions have been for people in healthcare. The HSD Institute started offering every weekday, at every weekday morning, an opportunity to go online, bring a challenge that you had, and have a community of people support you by helping you shift perspective on that challenge. It's the power of questions. I think they're like well into like 400 of these sessions now, just free opportunity for anyone to call in to be able to help people keep moving when you don't have all the answers, keep moving, leading when you don't have answers, move forward, not by assuming there's some external expert, but with a certain kind of thoughtful curiosity to be able to build adaptive capacity, to be able to pivot as you need to, but not so much that you keep pivoting and stay in the same place.
Currently in the health systems leadership field, physician voices and other, who are trying to bring awareness to some of the impending risks of not really bolstering up early childhood supports, parenting supports, some of that, the social determinants of health work. Mm-hmm. I know that it's a complex question, but if you were to design potentially a curriculum for educating a physician, leader, advocate in this space, what might be some of your imagined offerings for a curriculum? Where should they go?
This is so interesting. And what if leadership needs to be a willingness to embrace uncertainty, to listen to all the voices, to take adaptive action, to be able to keep learning and on the fly, and to operate in collaboration with others. The purpose of leading isn't just to fix the problems and leverage opportunities to achieve goals, but it's about adapting and learning and innovating so that groups can continually, iteratively make progress on the issues, even in unpredictable and changing conditions. Is our future going to be characterized by people seeking stability or adaptation? And will it be characterized by people seeking to include others or exclude others? And we made this little grid, and then we wrote stories for each of those quadrants. And the group that I was stewarding wrote the story about what would the future look like if people were seeking stability and seeking stability, but seeking to include others. One of the things that happened that was fascinating was that we could come up with predominantly positive scenarios if they were including others, whether they were about seeking stability or seeking adaptability, but we could not come up with positive scenarios that were seeking to exclude others. And those are the ones that wound up being most dystopian. We're sitting there, we have the curriculum, we all that stuff's been built. There's an opportunity to build forward. I live in the community where George Floyd was killed, where George Floyd was murdered. That's my precinct that was burned down, that we have still have no post office. I go to collect, to go to the pharmacy, and it's in a trailer. And I'm supporting, many of the people from the leadership work that I've done all these years who've been part of the community healing process, and building, like, what is it to rebuild the businesses that were destroyed during the uprising in response to George Floyd's murder. This is my community. These are people who are working to try and heal and transform and to build forward. We are not going back anywhere. And how do we make the moving forward appealing enough that it is greater than the fear that keeps us clinging to the status quo? Which again comes back to why art, why playfulness, why human connection. All of that has the potential to make the change more appealing than the resistance to letting go of what we know. Different environments call for me to claim the seat of my authority, my expertise. There's different environments. It calls for me to really step back and make room for others. When do I own my voice? I'm owning my voice a whole lot in this call. And when is it that I actually create space for others? I'm really aware. I haven't asked you a single question. This is
I've designed it as such. Please continue.
And I accepted the role. This is so right now. There's dynamics in this exchange, and so this is more space than I would take up in another environment. There's times to claim my stature as an elder. There's times to step back and to claim my space as my stature as someone who's learning and growing and naive and humbled by life every friggin' day. And there's just so it isn't that there's necessarily always it's like always one way, but to be able to see patterns clearly. That's the HSD vision, is everyone thrives because we see patterns clearly, we seek to understand, we act with courage to transform turbulence and uncertainty into possibility for all. Part of the seeing patterns clearly and understanding what the implications are and the meaning of those patterns lets me know what is appropriate for me to show up as a leader. Now, the key to that is that I have a broad enough palette of response ability that I can actually adapt to what's needed from me as a leader, as a follower, as a peer. Do I have that range of human capacity? Do I have the emotional intelligence to know that my desire to matter doesn't have to trump the desire for the collective to generate meaning, to generate the action?